Okay, and we are live. Um, so today I'm just going to be responding to a couple of videos by this channel, Thomistic Disputations. Um, there's not much to say here. One of the videos will just be an argument for the existence of God, and another one will be on transgender stuff. Um, I've actually talked to this guy, Thomistic Disputations. I talked to him on Twitter, on a Twitter space, and I don't really have anything against the dude. He posts some cringe on Twitter sometimes, and so I don't really endorse a lot of the stuff, a lot of his takes on Twitter. But in any case, I don't really have any problem with the dude overall. I've checked out a couple of his videos already. I haven't really watched the transgender one yet, so I'll be just watching it for the first time live here. But I think I have watched this one before. Um, and so, uh, basically, what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be um, responding to some of the uh, what I think of the premises and some of the sub-arguments he gives for the premises. And without further ado, let's get into it.
In this video, I will explain the first argument in my video, A Brief Argument for Christianity. The argument goes as follows. Everything that exists has existence in itself or in another. If all beings had existence in another, there would be no existence. Hence, there must be at least one being having existence in itself.
All right, so this is the basic syllogistic argument that he's going to be discussing um, in the video. And what you'll immediately notice is that the conclusion um, does not conclude that God exists. It just concludes that there must be at least one being with existence in itself. And well, that's because that this is just like the first in like a series of arguments. He's gonna take himself probably to have a collection of other arguments to establish um, that the being in question um, has, you know, the omni attributes, which are taken to be, how God is classically conceived in, at least in Anselmian theism, classical traditional theism as well. Um, so yeah, that's gonna be like this is basically just his argument that he seeks to establish the existence of a being that exists in itself, which I think he takes to just be like a basic definition of God. It's not fully it's not the full picture yet. Like he still has to argue for some of the other attributes, but uh, this is sort of like the foundation. This is like the number one argument. Um, and um, so there's a couple things that can be said about the premises though. So for premise one, everything that has existence in itself or in an okay, so everything that exists has existence in itself or in another. Um, so I would definitely push back on this premise um, because it seems to assume that there's like different senses of existence. That is to say that there's no univocal sense of existence. That ontology is equivocal. Um, and I think there are good reasons to think that this is not the case, and that um, all our talk of existence can be understood um, through like just one sense of existence, just the existential quantifier. Um, and there are a couple of reasons to believe this, and my reasoning here would be inspired by a recent paper I read not too long ago by Peter Van Wagen called Being, Essence, and Ontological Commitment. I definitely recommend you check it out, but P Peter Van Wagen gives a couple of reasons to think that existence is univocal. One of them is that existence has a similar relation to objects as numbers do. So, like when we say that you know um, say human beings exist, what we're saying there is that there is at least one human being. So there's like a relation like with numbers there. Or if we say that chihuahuas exist, what we're saying is that there are X amount of chihuahuas. There are like 500,000 chihuahuas, I guess we can say. Um, so, and clearly with numbers. there's no different sense of numbers. When we say that um, there's five, um, Greek poems, when we say that there's five computers, when we say that there's five people in this room, when we say that there's five trash cans, like there's no different sense. Like the word five there is univocal, right? It has no, there's no different sense um, in which there's five trash cans than in which there's five human beings, right? So that's one reason to think that there's no real difference between existence in itself and existence in another. So that's one of the reasons that Peter van den Wege gives. Another one is um, what this one's a little bit more complicated, but basically it's his Martian language argument against thick ontology, which basically like it goes something like this: like suppose that there is a Martian colony, right? And suppose that this Martian colony speaks this different Martian language, and in this language, they don't have any terms for exists, being, or whatever other Thomist lingo they want to use, like actual existence, potential existence, existence in itself, existence in another. They don't have any terms for that, right? But so the idea is, even despite the fact that they don't have any terms for like existence and being and whatnot, they don't seem to lose any expressive power. They can derive the same content by saying, it is the case that X. It is not the case that X. There is at least one X. There is not at least one X. Right? They don't lose any expressive power. Um, because if we make the assumption that all those terms denote the same concept for the purpose of an indirect proof, we can convey all the same content with those terms. So, um, like, in my view, that's a good reason to think that existence is not equivocal, but rather univocal. Um, so that's one way I would dispute premise one. And I think it's a very plausible way that premise one can be disputed. Um, and and so this the onus is then going to be on the Thomist to argue that we should conceive of existence as equivocal rather than univocal. Okay, so I'm just repeating myself at this point, but I just want to make sure that the criticism that I'm making here is really clear. And if you want to read about it more, I highly recommend you check out Peter Van den Wagen's um, paper Being, Essence, and Ontological Commitment. Um, it's definitely a good read, and Peter Van den Wagen himself is a theist, so it's not like you know he believes that there is a God, and he's a theist. I don't think he's a Thomist though. Um, and as for the second premise is basically it also relies on an assumption of existence that I think I'm going to leave it here for now because I think that he's going to discuss some premise two some more in a bit. But I think that we can think of we can derive a conception of existence on which premise two um, turns out to, if not be false, then at least to commit what is known as a quantifier shift fallacy. Um, so um, we'll see that in a bit.
Premise 1 is derived from Scott Sullivan's book, St. Thomas Aquinas and the Principle of Sufficient Reason. It can be divided into two parts. A, the idea that something has to have existence for it to exist, and B, that it either has to have existence in itself or in another. To prove the first part, we have to first define what we mean by existence. The way I'm
So yeah,
going to
one way that they would object to the first part, as you might say there, is that existence isn't like a substance. Like things don't have existence. There's no difference between a existing red car and just a red car. Like to say that a red car exists is just to say that the property of redness and carness are exemplified, right? Um, but I think he's going to address this criticism in the video, which we will see soon. Um, so yeah, basically to say has existence seems a bit inaccurate there. Things have properties; they don't have existence. Um, but so as we can see in the screen here, like he's just taking existence to be that which distinguishes something from nothing. Um, but there isn't going to be like a sense of existence that distinguishes, like, what distinguishes a rock from nothing is rockness, right? Because there's nothing to be distinguished from, right? When you say distinguished from nothing, like, there's nothing you are distinguishing it from, because it's nothing, right? So the only thing that distinguishes a rock from nothing is rock. That's like, there isn't this thing called existence which distinguishes something from nothing, because there's nothing for nothing to be distinguished from. Okay, I might be explaining myself badly, but when you say distinguish from nothing, like, it's nothing, right? So there's nothing really for a rock. There's nothing further that a rock needs to be distinguished from nothing other than the fact that it's a rock, right? And a rock isn't nothing. Like, there's a difference between a rock and nothing that we can see. And I don't think we have to be committed to there being this special property or some special predicate known as existence, which distinguishes all objects from nothing. Like, I don't see why we should buy into that. Um, but let's see how he goes further with this.
To define existence here is simply whatever it is that makes something distinct from nothing. Why do we need such a thing? According to the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, no two things which are the same in every way are distinct from each other. So, if a thing which exists is different from something which does not exist, it follows that there must be something about the existing thing which makes it different from the non-existing thing.
So what the thing is going to be is just going to be, what makes my water different from nothing is the fact that it's water, right? There isn't this thing called existence that distinct, like, I'm not sure why we should grant that there's this thing that all objects have that distinguishes them from nothing. No, there's nothing further to say other than my water is water. And right, that when we say that my water is water, we're not saying it's nothing. So there you go, right? There's nothing really further to say, and there's no difference between a water bottle that exists and a water bottle that doesn't exist, because to say that there's a water bottle there is just to say that, the property of whatever like properties a water bottle has is exemplified in the world. So, um, yeah, I'm not sure I really buy this, right? I can I'm you know the identity of indiscernibles is pretty uncontroversial, and I accept that, right? But this this doesn't mean I have to be committed to this thing called existence that distinguishes all things from nothing, right? I don't see why anyone should have to be committed to that.
That differentiating feature is what I'm going to call existence. It's important to note that I'm not making any claims about what the differentiating feature is here beyond the mere fact that it is the differentiating feature between existence and non-existence.
Yeah, but see, the problem here is going to be that I don't see why we should grant that there is the differentiating feature, right? Well, why should we think that, right? Why should we think that there is the differentiating feature as opposed to, like, objects, the the fact that, the properties the objects have is going to be just the differentiating feature from existing things, like, from non-existing things, right? I feel like I'm just repeating myself at this point, though. Like, but the basic idea is we don't have to be committed to there being the differentiating feature, right? And that's going to be the problem with the first part of the claim.
Nor am I saying that what it means to have the differentiating feature is anything. I'm not making any claims on what it is to
Well,
have.
if it is nothing, then, like, what are you even saying? If you're not making any claims about what it is to have existence, then, like, like, what are you saying then? Like, I take your claim to just be that all things that exist have some sort of difference between them from nothing. When I don't know, like, you're gonna have to give some further motivation for that.
Of the differentiating feature. I say this because I find that materialists often jump to thinking I'm saying existence is like a fundamental particle that has to be added to things that exist, or some kind of mysterious ethereal thing that is added to existing things.
Okay, so just to be clear, that's not the claim that I'm endorsing. I'm not saying that you're saying that there's this fundamental particle, like some sort of God juice, okay, that that all existence exemplifies. What I'm saying is that um, there isn't this thing that all things have in common that distinguish them from nothing, right? The fact that my rock is the fact that this this moai statue that I'm holding in my hand. I know you can't see me, but the fact that this sort of like mini moai statue that I'm holding in my hand, the thing that distinguishes it from nothing is just the properties that it has. It's just, the fact that it's condensed of hard material, the fact that it's within, it's shaped moai statue wise, the fact like just the fact that it's brown, like all the properties that it has are what distinguishes it from nothing, right? There isn't this thing called existence that distinguishes it from nothing. It's just the properties it has. And um and I think that this is going to be an important point because when we understand existence in this way, right? It Then we're gonna see that the second premise there doesn't do the work that it actually needs to do.
I'm not making a claim at all on this point. All I'm claiming is what follows from the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, that there has to be a distinguishing feature between existence and nothing. Another objection some present is that the difference between something that exists and something that does not exist is simply that the thing which exists is instantiated or has properties or some other explanation. Again, I'm not saying that this is not the case at this point. If what made existing things different from nothing.
So this is basically him um, taking himself to have preempted my criticism. But see, the problem is, right? There's no universal thing called existence which distinguishes all things from nothing, right? That's the criticism, right? Um, it's not like it's not. There's no universal like thing, like, right? The thing that distinguishes my rock from nothing is just the fact that it's a rock, right? So I don't see why we should grant that there's nothing further than that. And he seems to think that we can still use this notion of existence in such a way that makes his argument work. Um, but I think we're going to see later that actually it doesn't work, and I'll explain why later. But for now, we're focusing in on premise one. So let's focus on that first.
We're simply being instantiated or having properties, then that would be what existence is. I'm not in this argument saying anything about what existence is beyond defining it as that which makes something distinct from nothing. And if
Okay, well let's remember that he's not taking existence to be anything further. So let's assume from this point the position that all existence is just property exemplification, right? To say something red exists is to say that um, the property of redness is exemplified. Okay, so from this point on, um, let's assume that that's the notion of existence that we're working with.
you don't agree with that definition, then maybe you're talking about something different, right? I can define the word existence, however I like. There's no magical dictionary in the sky, as I like to say. A final objection I have heard is that it isn't possible to differentiate something from nothing because nothing isn't a thing. This objection
So that was kind of like one of the points I raised earlier. Let's see how he addresses it.
seems very misguided. You don't have to believe nothing is a thing to believe that there is a feature of existing things which distinguish them from nothing.
Okay, well that's um sure we can grant that, but um there isn't going to be this universal thing called existence. That like it just seems to be like missing the objection, right? There isn't this universal thing called existence which distinguishes existing things from non-existing things, right? Um the fact that my rock is my like this Moai statue is different from nothing is just it's just going to be just the fact that it's a Moai statue. There's nothing further than that. The fact that my computer is different from nothing is just the fact that it exemplifies the computer properties that a computer has. And there's nothing further than that. There isn't this thing called existence, uh, or at least, well. I mean, at least he hasn't motivated that there is this thing called existence that distinguishes all things from nothing, right? It seems that view has not yet been motivated.
Also, if there were no such a differentiating feature, how would we know that something exists? But
Well, I mean, I just take it that existence is going to be included um, in our understanding of um, just objects exemplifying properties. Um, so I mean, I don't understand. Like the thing that you need to, I mean, the thing that you need to argue here is that there's this sense of existence that's universal, on which all things must exemplify to distinguish themselves from nothing. But I mean, I mean, I'm not saying that that's a false view, but I'm just saying that you need to do some work to motivate that view.
other things do not exist. Now, as far as the second part of the first premise, this is obviously true because having existence in itself or in another exhausts all possible places a differentiating feature.
So I can grant that it exhausts everything, but this sort of misses the point of like how someone would object to this premise, right? The way someone would object to this premise is not that what you've done here is um you have like a mutually exhaustive premise, right? I can grant that, right? Like it exhausts all possibilities. I can grant that, right? But it seems to me that we can say that there's no different senses of existence, right? There's no such thing as existence in itself or in another, right? There's only existence, the existential quantifier. To say something exists is just to say there is at least one of X. It is the case that X. It is not the case that there is no X, right? There is no universe. There's no distinction here, right? We can carry all our semantics and we can convey all the same semantical content with just the existential quantifier. So it's false that there is existence in another and in itself, right? There's just existence, right? Which is going to be cashed out in the existential quantifier. So um, I must conclude then at this point that premise one is not sufficiently motivated, and we're gonna have to move on to his justification for premise two.
Could be. There is nothing beyond a thing itself or another thing. I think this part will really be non-controversial, so I'm not going to continue any
I would say that you thought wrong here.
further on this. The second premise in this argument essentially rules out an infinite regress where there is no being without existence in itself.
And keep in mind, Um, earlier, he said that he granted that we can just take existence to be property instantiation, right? So keep in mind when he talks about if all beings had existence in another, there would be no existence. He's talking about property instantiation. So we can reword the premise essentially to say something like if all beings had property instantiation in another, then there would be no existence. So from this point, just grant his controversial assumption of non-univocal ontology, and at this point, we're gonna see that if we use an understanding of existence in terms of property exemplification to see if this premise goes through, and my thesis here is going to be that the premise does not go through, and I'll explain why um, after we just see some of his justification that he tries to give for the premise.
Just beings with existence in another. As an analogy, suppose I tell you I have $1,000,000 in the bank. Now, suppose you go to this bank and the bank tells you that I do indeed have $1,000,000, but that this bank has that $1,000,000 in another bank, say Bank 2, which has the money in Bank 3, etc., on into infinity. If this is true, then none of the banks have my $1,000,000 in them, which also means I don't have $1,000,000 in the banks at all, right? There's no bank in which my $1,000,000 exists. So I don't have $1 million.
Okay, so um, what? So basically, his basic argument here against the infinite regress is if we imagine that there's no being that possesses existence in itself, is what he calls it, um, such that like they have existence and they don't depend on anything else for existence, is what I take it what he means by existence in itself, right? And he's saying that if we just have existence from another, so we have, this Moai statue. Okay, I keep saying Moai statue, but you can't see it. It's kind of worthless, but let's just say rock, okay? Let's just say rock, okay? So it's less confusing, right? Let's just say rock. Um, so let's say a rock derives its existence from, I don't know, its molecules, right? And its molecules derive its existence from some subatomic particles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, dependency, dependency, dependency. If none of the things which the rock's existence depends on terminates in something that exists in itself, right? Then it's going to turn out that the rock doesn't exist, right? Because it doesn't derive its existence from anywhere. Now, here's the thing. Let's look at this from the point of view of property instantiation, right? So a standard example would be um, redness, right? So I think I watched another one of his videos where he used the example of a red ball, and we can actually take that because I think that's going to actually be um, useful for us to understand um, this idea. So suppose we have a red ball that's painted with red paint, right? Um, so the ball is not red in itself, right? It doesn't exemplify redness in itself. Um, its redness depends on the paint, right? It depends on the fact that it's painted red, and the redness of the paint depends on some molecules, some smaller sort of atoms, right? And so what we have, in order for redness to be exemplified in the first place, we're going to have to terminate somewhere such that there is something that exemplifies redness in itself, something that has redness but doesn't depend on something else for its redness, right? So that, that's an easy way to understand it, I think. Um, that's an easy way to understand it. I think I've done a decent job explaining it. So here's the problem, right? I can grant that for each property, for the existence of each property, right? Because remember, we're assuming here that all existence is property instantiation, right? For each property, say redness, um, it's going to terminate in something that's red in itself that does not depend in redness of another, right? I can grant that, but it doesn't follow that there is something that has existence in itself that doesn't derive existence from another, right? Because for each property that exemplifies right, like for each property that exemplifies an exemplifiable such as redness, right, they can terminate in something that doesn't depend on something else for its redness, but doesn't follow that um, the object that doesn't depend on anything else for its redness couldn't be dependent in some other way, right? It could be dependent. um, I don't know, like it could be dependent on um, I don't know, like suppose it's just some contingent being that depends um on something for its shape, right? Or it's something for um its constitution in other respects, right? So just because that there's something that has redness in itself, it doesn't follow, right? It doesn't follow that there's something that has existence in itself. I can grant that this is true for every property instantiation, right? I can grant that my Moai statue depends on the rock from which it was constituted, from which it was like chiseled away at. Um, from I don't know. I'm probably explaining myself badly. Excuse me. Like I'm pretty autistic, so and I'm pretty bad at explaining myself. Like this is why I prefer like typing and explaining myself in um, yeah, just typing, right? But just it depends on the rock from which it was constituted, and the rock itself depends on some lesser molecules, right? I can grant for any property that there's something that has that property in itself that doesn't depend on anything else in that particular way, right? But it doesn't follow that there's going to be some ultimate being that has existence in itself that doesn't depend on anything else in any way, right? Right? Just because there's a object that has redness in itself that is independent and doesn't depend on anything else qua redness, right? It doesn't follow from that that um, that that it's going to be independent simplicator, right? And if we just view existence just as this idea of property exemplification, then that's going to be true for all properties, right? There is no there, so we don't have an infinite regress, and we don't have any properties which you know don't we have our properties which eventually terminate in exemplifying the property in themselves, right? But we don't have existence in itself because all existence is property exemplification on this view. So, um, in reality, all this premise does is commit a quantifier shift. Just because for each property exemplification, and I've been explaining myself like 20 times at this point, but just because for each property exemplification, um, the property does not depend on something else for its exemplifying that property. This does not entail, right? It does not entail that um, that there's some ultimate being that's completely independent in all respects in terms of like just qua existence itself, right? Um, does not follow, right? So this premise it seems unmotivated, and it commits what is known and as a quantifier fallacy, right? Just because for each property um, and a quantifier shift fallacy is going to be something like just because um, each man has a mother, right, does not entail that there's a mother of all men, right? Um, in the same way, just because for each um, property exemplification, it's going to terminate in um, something that does not derive its property from anything else, right? It doesn't follow that there is something that exists in itself from which all existence is exemplified, right? It just does not follow, right? It's just a quantifier shift fallacy. So that's the problem with the premise, and I might not have been explaining myself in the best way, but I feel like I did a decent job, all things considered, considering I have like an extreme form of autism here. Um, but I hope um, that you can track the reasoning here, right? It just does not follow, right? Uh, if we take existence, and he seemed to have granted that earlier, if we take existence to just be property exemplification, um, the argument doesn't do the work it needs to do, right? It's just a quantifier shift fallacy.
The entire idea of this sort of infinite regress is really just trickery. Because in order to have something, it has to exist somewhere. You can't just keep deferring to something else infinitely without the thing in question actually existing.
Right. And if all existing is again, remember, we're granting here that all existing is property instantiation, right? And we can grant that all property instantiations must terminate in something exemplifying the property in itself, but this does not follow that there must be one um, thing that has existence in itself, right? That has property exemplification in itself. Like whatever the fuck that even means, right? Um, we don't have to grant anything weird like that, right? We can grant that there's no infinite regress, but it just simply does not follow from this. It just manifestly just complete non sequitur. Like does not follow from this that there's something that has existence in itself. So if we grant existence in the sense that of property exemplification, then the argument just doesn't work. It fails.
Uh, so my argument more formalized goes as follows. If there is an infinite series where every member has existence in another, no member has existence in itself. If no member has existence in itself, no member can have existence in another. Therefore, an infinite series where every member has existence in another is impossible.
Right? Seems to me that if we take existence to just be a certain kind of property exemplification, so it seems like we can just grant the premise and it just doesn't do the work that he wants it to. Or if we don't take it in that way, um, then premise one is false, right? Because um, like it doesn't just doesn't follow like because each um, exemplifiable could have like could terminate in something that has that exemplifiable in itself, right? And it just does not follow that existence itself needs to be exemplified in itself, right? just doesn't follow, right? So it's either going to be the case that premise one's false, or I can just accept the argument and you just don't you haven't motivated the your claim.
And if that's not possible, then the conclusion follows that there must be at least one being having existence in itself. In other words, there must at least be one being which has that by which things are distinguished from nothing. In
Right. So just to recap, premise one assumes equivocal ontology, um, which I take it that there are good reasons to think that equivocal ontology is just bunk. And Peter von Inwagen, who's a theist, himself rejects non-univocal ontology. So we can just reject that, and then the argument doesn't even get started. And then we have premise two, um, which commits a subtle quantifier shift fallacy. Like just because for each predicate or property, um, it's going to terminate in something that possesses that exemplifiable in itself and doesn't derive it from another. It doesn't follow that, you know, it can't be dependent in some other way, that the chain can't be dependent in some other way, that has nothing to do with, like, say redness. Like it could be independent qua redness, right? But it could be dependent in some other way, for its like shape or its particular constitution in some other way, its configuration. Um, so it just, right. So premise one assumes non-univocal ontology. Premise two, quantifier shift. That's basically the criticism that I would have.
itself. I entitled this proof the existence of God because that which has existence in itself really is the basic definition of God. This is based.
And so yeah, he basically takes existence in itself to be a basic definition of God. Uh, in a dialectical context, if I were like to like have a discussion with this dude, um, which I actually have had a discussion with him before, I would not grant um, that existence in itself is enough is sufficient for like godlikeness. I think you need to say something further, such as like the properties of omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection. Well, if not moral perfection, at least absolute goodness. But I don't like some Thomists take those to be distinct, but I take moral perfection to just be an absolute maximal sense of goodness qua, persons. So some Thomists will like dispute me on that, but I don't think it really matters. Like, um, in any case, yeah, I don't think that this argument is sufficient to establish God at all. And even if it was, I think both the premises are questionable. Um, and in any case, I do take it that he has some other videos where he takes himself to establish the divine attributes. I haven't checked out most of those videos, but um, from what I've seen, like from what I've seen from like Phaser and like other Thomists, um, the kind of arguments they use to get from unactualized actualizer to omnipotent omniscient being, I find them unconvincing, and I think that the gap issue is actually genuinely a big issue. Like right, for take example like goodness, right? Or like having an intellect, right? When they say God is good, right? Um, or perfectly good, they're gonna try and argue that, well, he has no unactualized potentialities, right? But it doesn't seem to follow that there's an interesting sense of like moral perfection there, right? I mean, um, a perfect circle, right, has no unactualized potentialities, right? It's perfect. It has absolute perfection qua circle, right? It's a perfect circle. Um, and you can imagine that being an object which has no unactualized potencies. And so there's no like interesting like substantive normative conclusion there, which you would expect from a sort of personal loving God, right? Um, and that's the kind of I think that there's major issues with the stage two arguments, and I'm generally not convinced by them. And I also think that there's um, a priori reasons to think that um, a being with a conjunction of um, omni attributes can't exist. Um, I think that there's good reasons to think that. Like for example, I don't understand what it means for like something to have a timeless mind, right? It seems to me that what it is to have a mind is to have a sequence of phenomenological states, like a sequence of thoughts, thinking inferentially, changing your beliefs, actualizing your desires, right? That all seems to be things that are linked with time, right? Um, Now there is omniscience, omnipotence, and having a mind, right? Um, I mean, like, how could a being that's omnipotent and omniscient eternally, that has a perfect will, right? Um, at any point in time, their desires are already going to be actualized, right? Because for any point in time, um, you already have the necessary and sufficient conditions for their desires to be actualized. Um, and so they don't at any point actualize their desires because um, their desires are already going to be actual at any point, right? Um, so that seems to me to be inconceivable as well. So and then there's also other considerations which I think count against um, the omni attributes God, which is such as the logical problem of evil. And yes, I do think that a logical problem of evil, properly stated, is successful. And I actually have talked to Thomistic about a version of the problem of evil, which I take to be successful. A logical problem of evil, I should say. And then, of course, you have some further arguments, which are a posteriori, evidential considerations, like just pieces of data, just evidential chips, which seem, to be less surprising if we take a view such as naturalism or atheism, and more surprising if we take a view such as theism. Um, but I mean, this is more like uh, um, atheology. This is more like arguments for the existence against the existence of God. Um, I guess I can discuss those in a different video, but uh, for the purposes of this topic, I think all I really need to say here is uh, premise one uh, assumes existence is equivocal. Premise two commits a quantifier shift fallacy, and three does not get you to God in the relevant sense that we're interested in.
Based on the definition of God given in Exodus 3:14, where Moses asks God how he ought to refer to God. God says, "I am who am," in response. As the Catechism of the Catholic Church states, the revelation of the
I'm
ineffable
gonna
name,
speed this up.
"I am who am," contains then the full truth that God alone is. The Greek Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, and following the Church's tradition, understood the divine name in this sense: God is the fullness of being and of every perfection, without origin and without end.
Okay, I can grant that that's going to be a necessary property of God, right? But just like there's a difference between necessary and sufficient conditions, right? I can grant that having existence in itself, right? Having existence as a part of one's being, having existence, an essence which entails existence. I can grant, or however you want to cash it out, I can grant that that's going to be a necessary condition for what we might call godhood, right? Um, but it doesn't seem to me that that's a sufficient condition, right? Because when most philosophers of religion, at least in the literature, are talking about God, right? They're not talking about some, spooky existence itself thing, right? They're talking about a being with the omni attributes, right? And that seems to be the interesting sense of God that's talked about in the literature, which is why I think even Thomistic acknowledges this on some level, right? Because he doesn't he clearly doesn't see fit to just have this argument and leave it at there, right? He has other videos that argue for the omni attributes.
And all creatures receive all that they are and have from him, but he alone is his very own being, his very being. And he is of himself everything that he is. So having a proof that ends with something which has existence in itself is key to proving the existence of God. It doesn't prove that God is one, omnibenevolent, etc., but this is proof in other arguments. It's also limited in the sense that it doesn't prove technically that God's essence is existence. It just proves that
Oh, okay.
God has existence, and
I mean,
that could mean that
that's even more trivial, right? Having existence, like what? Having existence, that's just trivial. Like I have existence. I think he might have misspoke there, though.
there's other things in addition to that. Maybe existence is just a part of God. But as I said, these objections or potentialities are disproven in later arguments. Just FYI, I decided to open up a Patreon account. I want to allow my closest followers to have more input on which
All
atheist
right,
arguments I destroy.
so that's pretty much all that needs to be said on this particular video. Um, yeah, so we're gonna move on to this video, a conservative response to transgenderism. I don't believe I've watched this video before. I might have, um, but I have a feeling that a lot of the thesis of this video is going to depend on some of some metaphysical assumptions in the background. Um, and I take it that this video is going to be primarily philosophical rather than citing studies um, on trans suicide. At least I hope so, because that wouldn't be very fun. Because I already did it. I already did a stream debunking a meme with regards to trans suicide statistics. But um, without further ado, let's get into this one.
I wanted to talk a little bit today about both the idea of transgenderism and transsexualism, and how it should be approached philosophically. Transgenderism is the
So I think I was right then. Um, this is going to be a philosophical approach, not a data-based approach, which is good for me because I did not read any of the sources that he might cite. Um, so and plus I don't really think um, that would be fun to address anyways.
idea that men and women can
Sorry, let's
change
go back. Let's go back.
them, and how it should be approached philosophically. Transgenderism is the idea that men and women can change their gender.
Okay, so not exactly. Um, it's kind of like a minor point, right? It's not that they can change their gender, right? Um, you can be transgender and you won't really change. I mean, I guess you kind of in the sense that you acknowledge that your gender doesn't match your sex, but that's all what transgender is. Like your gender, which is to say, is going to be like a gender is just going to be constituted by a set of social features or social characteristics or cultural characteristics. We might even say like mental properties such as the desire to get transitional therapy, the desire to perform a certain way. That's what gender is going to be constituted by, and it's going to be um, a spectrum in that sense. Um, but um, I, like he basically said that all it is the idea that you can change your gender, but that's not really. It's having a gender and a sex that are different from each other. That's a more accurate sense of transgenderism.
Whereas gender is defined as our understanding of what men and women are socially.
Okay, that's a I have no disputes there. That's fine. Understanding of gender.
Transsexualism is the idea that male and female can change their sex.
No, not exactly. Transsexualism is just a trans people who have had gender reassignment surgery or sex reassignment surgery or transitional therapy, right? That's all transsexualism is, and I don't think many, if any, transsexuals are committed to the idea that they actually like change their sex, right? They're still producing, like they still have like the same chromosomes, chromosomal structure. They still have the same, you know, gametes. They still have the same, internal organs and whatnot, sexual organs. Um, what they're doing is they're changing their outside features. They're changing, their secondary sex characteristics most of the time. That's all transsexual is. I don't think they actually claim to change their sex. I mean, like probably some do, right? But that's certainly not my view, and I don't think it's the view of most transsexuals.
Which is defined as the biological differences between males and females. Often these views come also with this idea that sex and gender are not binaries, but are on a spectrum.
Sex and gender are not binaries. Um, I think yeah, it's correct that I would say that it's correct that both sex and gender are not binaries. Yes. Um, because with sex, like no matter how you construe sex, like even if you strictly define sex as, um, the comedic entailed definition of sex is what it's called. Even if you define it as that, you still have like hermaphrodites, true simultaneous hermaphrodites, and I might actually link that in the study in the description if it becomes a point that's of major concern with this video. Um, I might link it in the description. But in any case, um, yeah, yeah, I think it's correct that neither of them are non-binary, and I think it's even more obvious that gender is not non-binary because it's going to be just a set of social characteristics, really.
Doesn't always come with that idea, but often it does.
Okay, fair enough.
Now, a lot of conservatives try to respond to these views by appealing to genetic essentialism. What they will say is something like, no matter how you define yourself or how many modifications you make to your body, you will always have either XY or XX chromosomes.
Okay, so I don't think that he's saying that this is his view. I think this is what he's saying. He's saying that that's how conservatives tend to respond to it. I don't think he's taking that to be his view. I guess we'll have to continue watching to see.
And that's what makes you male or female. Of course, the problem with this view is that that's not always true. Sometimes people have variations in the number of chromosomes, and what's more is X and Y chromosomes are not always identical. To which conservatives will often just say, yes, but we define things based on what's most common. And that might be true, but you've already sort of lost if you omitted that there can be exceptions to the rule. If there can be exceptions to the rule, then X and Y chromosomes don't define what men are.
Okay, so I don't disagree with anything he's saying here, but I don't really think that the dialectic here really turns on like chromosomes, right? Seems to me that what the dialectic here turns on is a distinction between sex and gender, right? When we're talking about gender, we're not like we can grant that sex. We can even like even a lot. In fact, I think a lot of transgender people even tend to grant this that there's only two sexes. I wouldn't grant it because we have hermaphrodites, but I think that transgender people can grant that um, sex in terms of biology is binary, or at least bimodal, right? Um, yeah, that's something that can be granted, but that's not the dialectic, right? The dialectic is when we talk about transgender people identifying as a certain gender, we're talking about them identifying with some set of social characteristics, right?
Women are. Also, in some species, male and female are not differentiated based on X and Y chromosomes, even in the most common cases. So, how do we respond? The key is the division between essence and properties. Let's take the case of a
So essence and properties. I think he's going to be appealing to um, some form of oh, um, Aristotelian essentialism here. Is what's going to be going on here. I guess we're going to have to wait and see.
dog, for example. A dog is defined as a four-legged animal. That said, we all have seen dogs with 3 legs. If we applied the same logic that transgenderists apply to sex and gender, what we would have to say is that, well, a dog doesn't really have 4 legs. A dog has a spectrum of legs.
Okay, so this is a misrepresentation. When transgender people say that gender is a spectrum, they're not talking about sex, right? Right? For all the great transgender person can do, they can grant that that sex essentialism is true, right? They can grant that sex essentialism is true, that there's only like two sexes that have essential properties or whatnot. But we're not talking about sex, right? When we're talking about transgenderism in the relevant sense, we're talking about people identifying with a certain social category, right? Um, and that social category is just going to be like it doesn't have any essential properties because all it is, right, is just going to be some conjunction of uh, social characteristics such as what people wear, what their gaits are, their vocal tonality, the kind of ways they express themselves, the way they paint their nails, right? Lipstick, long hair, short hair, right? What they wear. I think I already say what they wear, but you do get the point. Just it's going to be a set of social characteristics of how people present themselves in society, how people express themselves in society. That's what gender is going to be, right? And in this sense, it is a spectrum, right? Because you can have some set of social characteristics and fail to have some other set of social characteristics, and it's going to be kind of unclear where you lie on the spectrum, right? Um, so this is just a misrepresentation, I take it, of what trans people are saying. Um, because trans people can grant sex realism, right?
Eggs. But this could be applied to any property that a dog has. If a dog doesn't have eyes, a nose, or a tail, we'd also still say that it's a dog. So are those parts of the spectrum too? It begins to look as if there isn't really a definition of what a dog is.
Yeah, I mean, this is just irrelevant. We can grant that that species like dogs are a natural kind, right? And there's a fact of the matter of what a dog is, or even what a certain sex is, and the way we determine that fact of the matter is going to be biological characteristics, right? We can grant all that, right? But all you're doing here is equivocating sex and gender, right? We're not talking about um, sex when we're talking about transgenderism or even transsexualism, right? Because transsexualism is they're not claiming to be a different sex, right? They're just performing their gender characteristic by choosing to have sex reassignment surgery and presenting themselves in a certain way. That's gender, right? That's still gender. Um, so that's what this turns on.
After all, I think what's actually going on here is that we don't actually define things by the properties they have. To understand what I mean, look at how we define male and female. Generally, a female is defined as an organism which produces the gametes that are fertilized. And males have the gametes that fertilize the female's gametes.
Right. So on this definition of male and female, it's just gonna be not. It's just not gonna be the case that male and female are binary, right? Even on like this is by the way, this definition is called the gametic definition, the gametic entailed definition, right? Um, and it's not even like the most popular definition used in the literature. I don't think. I think there's like a bunch of other definitions, like chromosomal definitions, secondary sex characteristic definitions, right? I think there's a bunch of different definitions of sex in the literature, and this is just one, right? This is just one. And even on this definition, sex isn't going to be binary because um, like you have true simultaneous hermaphrodites, right? You have actual hermaphrodites who have both gametes, can produce both small and large gametes, right? Can fulfill both roles in reproduction, and on this understanding, they're going to be both male and female, right? Um, so we don't even have to talk about chromosomes there. It's just objectively the case that they have both gamete productions. And I think that there's even people with certain um, reproduction disabilities that can't produce either gametes. I'm not sure what that one's called, but I think that's the case. Like, and then in that case, they'd just be sexless. They'd be neither male nor female. At least I think that that's going to be the case in certain animal species. I'm not sure if it's a occurrence among humans. I haven't done the research on that. I think it might be, but I know for a fact that true simultaneous hermaphrodites are a thing.
But does that mean that if your gametes are not being fertilized, that you're not a female? Or what's more is that we generally say that infants are males or females, but males at least don't have their gametes until puberty.
So, yeah, like how this would be fixed is basically just saying the capacity, like having the latent capacity to produce certain gametes, right? They don't need to say that they're actively, like it's active, right? It's like an active potency. Uh, I think as a Thomist, he might actually like this way of understanding it in terms of like active potencies versus you know potential potencies. Um. Anyways, we can move
Should
on.
we say that a male baby isn't actually a male? Or relocate their sexual identities to their genetics? If we do the latter, then it would follow that no one knew whether they were male until we discovered genetics, which is absurd. What's going on here?
Well, I mean, it's gonna be kind of it's gonna be kind of like a weird thing, right? Because we knew what water was um, before we discovered its chemical composition as H2O, and this is a common example that people use in this sort of context. Um, so yeah, I agree that we had a concept of what it is to be a male and a female, independent of like our scientific understanding of it. But still going to be identical in the sense that there's going to be what's known as even if it's not like an analytic identity, right? In the same way that water doesn't have an analytic identity with H2O, right? We have a different sense for water, like that odorless, colorless liquid that fills oceans and falls from the sky, right? And then we have, you know, this other understanding of like certain chemicals, right? And we understand that the chemical composition of water is H2O. Um, and it's going to be like sort of like a similar case here, right? We had an understanding of what a male is, like those guys who have like those ding dongs uh, that are in their groinal area, um, who play a certain role in reproduction, right? We can have an understanding of male, independent of our scientific understanding of it. Yeah, I agree with that. Um, I feel like I'm rambling, and I feel like I should let him talk a little bit longer because we've been going for an hour so far, and I feel like I should let him get to his point.
Here, I think, is that male and female are not terms we define by actual properties that the organisms have.
Um, I don't see how he's argued that at all. Like, right? Um, like it seems to me that we can define them in terms of in terms of like the capacity to produce large gametes, right? And that's a property, right? We can understand that to be at least like a sort of um, potential property. Um, and I don't think he's going to have a problem with potential properties. I wouldn't think so, at least. Um, um, I mean, seems to me that there's no problem here.
But by the tendency towards an end that they have.
Okay, so I kind of had a feeling that it was going to get to this. So um, he's basically gonna he's basically positing this idea of like teleology in nature that there's like a certain telos to man, um, and a man's like objective teleological end is going to be fulfilled to fulfill their design to have like reproductive to fulfill like a certain end in reproduction. So he's basically proposing that there's this idea of teleology in nature, right? And um, he's gonna need to do a little bit to motivate that though, because we can just take um, the role in reproduction to just be a biological disposition. I don't understand why we'd have to take it to be teleological, right? Uh, and he didn't really he didn't really explain why we can't just identify male just with those biological features, right? I mean, just at least having yeah, yeah, those like a male baby is still going to have certain biological features which we can use to identify them, right? We don't need to bring this idea of like uh, teleologically or teleology or like having a tendency towards some natural end in order to understand what a male is or what a female is. And if you want to say that there is this teleology in nature, um, you're going to have to make some substantive metaphysical assumptions, I think, which will need to be motivated.
Male babies tend to develop gametes that fertilize female gametes. So we call them male. Since this is a constant tendency, we cannot merely attribute this tendency to chance.
So you say it's a constant tendency, but then it seems like you're going to have to grant that in the case of hermaphrodites, they have both ends, right? They have both. They objectively have the capacity to produce large and small gametes, be impregnated and impregnate, right? So it seems to me like wouldn't on this view wouldn't you have to say um, that hermaphrodites have a tendency towards both ends, and in that case, uh, you'd have to say that they're both male and female. It doesn't seem. I don't. Doesn't. It seems to me that given your logic here, that's what you'd have to say, right? Um, unless you have like some reason to think that hermaphrodites are an exception. I don't know what that reason would be. Um, that wouldn't be like sort of like an ad hoc appeal. Um, I don't know. Like maybe he has something else to say here. Um, I'm just gonna listen because it seems to me like if you're just gonna reduce the sort of biological features of male and female to like and say that there's like a teleology to them, then it seems to follow that hermaphrodites have both teleological ends. Um, I don't know. Maybe he has a response to this point. I'm not sure.
Rather, there must be something in the male that is the cause of this consistent tendency of males to produce these gametes.
So it's just going to be some sort of like, I just appeal to science there. It's just biological features. Um, and there needs to be some argument to establish that we need to understand it in terms of teleology in nature. I see no reason to
Because
dispute
they
that,
have this
especially if you're going to say that there's this normative component of teleology and say that people ought to fulfill certain ends, right? I certainly don't see any reason to believe that, especially due to considerations such as the naturalistic fallacy, which is a basic Morean argument that goes back to the early 1900s. Um, um, I mean, I don't know if that's the kind of argument he's making. I guess I could run that, and I actually have talked to him about this before, the Morean naturalistic fallacy. Um, but I take it that it's more of like a problem for analytic identities, and you can try to escape. Like the main response that moral naturalists have is to say that there's a synthetic identity between um, um, certain natural facts and certain normative properties, right? Um, but this is kind of like a complex like sort of issue, and he hasn't really said anything normative here. But if he does say something normative here, um, then we might have to get into that whole topic. My own position is that I'm not convinced that we can derive um, normativity from non-normative facts non-fallaciously. That's my own position, and the reason and the way I would justify this is via the naturalistic fallacy, which I take to actually be distinct to the open question argument. The open question argument's an issue is like is the argument that Moore used, and it's kind of hard to explain, but I think that there's a distinction between the naturalistic fallacy and the open question argument. But the open question argument is the one that's more taken to be like a positive objection to naturalism. Um, and I'm not sure, and I don't think it succeeds due to some issues. Um, some people, like I think Moore's original argument was criticized for being question begging, um, and we can also consider that there are ways of informatively defining, um, like for example, married bachelor is a tautology, right? But married to say a bachelor is married is informative in a way that a bachelor is not. And so there are some criticisms of Moore's open question argument. Um, I'm not sure that they ultimately succeed, but that's another topic. And I also think that the naturalistic fallacy, which applies to just analytic reductions of the good, um, is a bigger problem. Anyways, is more of a competent issue. Um, anyways, but I don't know if he's going to be making any normative claims here. So maybe I'm just jumping ahead of the curve here.
principle of limitation, which leads them towards the end of producing male gametes. We call them males. And the same
So yeah, he's just using again he's just using a language of teleology here. Um, so we're gonna have to wait to see if he actually justifies it.
logic applies to females. If you watched my video proving Christianity, the forms are grasped
I have
by
not.
God, I go more into detail about how essence is a limitation on existence. Going back to the three-legged
So that's gonna come into like more controversial metaphysical assumptions that are really complicated, such as whether or not essence and existence are even ontologically distinct, which is itself a controversial topic. And my own position is I don't buy that essence and existence. There's a real ontological distinction there. Um, but of course, as a Thomist, he takes the opposite view. So that's just that's there. There's more metaphysical issues there. But like for the sake of saving time, let's just continue the video.
dogs, likewise, we would still say that the three-legged dog has four legs by nature. That is, a dog as considered with respect to its internal limitation of its tendency towards an end.
I'm not sure why we should say that. Um, there's just going to be a lot. you're gonna need to know a lot of justification to say that. And even if we do grant all of this, right? Remember, if we even if we do grant all of this, that there is essential features of dogs, like dogs a natural kind, and there's an essential feature qua dog that dogs exemplify, and there's even essential features of certain sexes, right? Even if I grant this sort of sex realism, right? Gender realism doesn't follow from that. You need to establish the further claim that all these social features um, necessarily follow from the sexes exemplifying their ends, right? Um, and so far, nothing he said has justified that.
In this way, we make a distinction between the properties and nature. That is a distinction between the limitation that leads to the actual manifestation of properties and the manifestation, which is what we call properties.
Yeah. So just to clarify once more, um, just to clear it up once again, I should say, all of this is going to be assuming a certain ontology, which is going to need to be motivated, and which I don't accept. So um, that's all I really need to say there.
Thus, we can say that although the manifestation of a human being's sex or the manifestation of the number of a dog's legs can be on a spectrum, the underlying nature by which we define these things remains the same. When the manifestation is consistent with the underlying nature, we call these properties or proper accidents. When we are talking about manifestations contrary to nature, this is an accident which is improper or disordered. And so when the left is
Okay, so um, when he makes a distinction between proper and improper, and he says that like when a dog has three legs, that's sort of like an improper instantiation of nature. I'm not sure if he's saying anything normative there, so I'm not sure if I should if he falls into Morian arguments or Hume's guillotine type arguments. Um, I'm not sure if he runs into that, but um, furthermore, it's just not clear why we should think um, of like beings why we should think of it the same way he does, right? Why we should think of nature having a certain teleology where we have um, you know certain natural kinds exemplifying their like some objective ends, right? I don't know, like, he hasn't really motivated that yet, right? It really seems interesting, right? It seems like he's saying a lot of interesting philosophy here, right? Um, but to me, it just seems like he hasn't really motivated the view, right? I don't really buy it. Um, so I guess I guess we'll just continue watching to see what else he has to say.
appealing to individuals with messed up chromosomes or odd genitals, they are appealing to males or females with improper accidents.
Yeah. So I mean, so what? Um, and by the way, we don't even have to appeal to like different chromosomes here, right? We actually have um, hermaphrodites who can produce both gametes, right? Like they actually exemplify both ends, right? Seems to me that on your view, they have both teleological ends since they have the biological disposition to produce both small and large gametes, right? But in any case, I don't see why we should think of them as objective ends, and why I don't understand why we had to import teleology here, right? Why can't we just view them as biological dispositions, right? It seems like you're making some metaphysical assumptions here that um, I mean need some at least some justification, some argumentation.
They still have the same underlying nature of being a male or a female. It's just that the manifestation is improper or disordered.
So yeah, I just wouldn't grant that. Like why think that there's an underlying nature of male and female? Why think that, right? Um, his only case for that is just this appeal to teleology, which um, I mean doesn't seem to even justify the view, and Like it doesn't like even on his own notion of teleology. Like it seems to me that he has no resources with which to say that hermaphrodites um, aren't um, aren't exemplifying like both ends, right? They have two natural ends, right? It doesn't seem to me he has any resources on his own view to say that hermaphrodites aren't um, aren't an exception to this to the idea of like a binary sex. And by the way, this is all talking about sex, right? We can even grant all this. We can grant that sex is binary even, right? I wouldn't grant that, right? Seems to me that the best literature in the sciences indicates that sex is a bimodal distribution, not binary. Um, but even if I grant all this, right? Um, there's still a distinction between sex and gender, right? And I'm not sure, like, there's still 6 minutes of the video yet left, so he's probably going to get to it eventually. But that's all this is just an equivocation between sex and gender. I can grant that there are essential properties and there's an essential nature to sex, right? Um, that constitutes in just exemplifying objective teleological ends or whatever. I can grant all of that. I can just sit here and shake my head and be like, okay, Thomistic disputations. Fuck, I'm bad at pronouncing shit. Okay, Thomistic disputations. Right. I agree. I agree. Right. There's this objective sense of sex which involves exemplifying objective ends, and I'm going to assume that the ends are what God designed them for, or whatever, right? I'm going to shake my head and I'm going to agree. There's not merely biological dispositions. There's objective biological ends for sexes, right? Doesn't follow from this that um, there's that, that there's objective properties to gender, um, and that like right, because gender is just a bunch of social characteristics, and in order for Thomistic's point to go through here, he'd have to say that certain sexes have an objective biological end for exemplifying all these like a certain set of social characteristics, and if you fail to exemplify this end, then you're failing to exemplify um, I don't know the proper sense of gender which was ordained by God or something. I don't know exactly how he'd want to put it, but it seems to me that he's going to want to say something like that, right? But everything he said so far, just at best, is a defense of sex realism, which, um, I mean, okay, um, sure. I mean, seems like we can just grant that there are objective biological features to the sexes, um, and there's a fact of the matter there, but we're not talking about gender yet.
The same, incidentally, is true of homosexuals. Many people will argue that homosexuals are naturally homosexual. But just because a homosexual has an uncontrollable attraction to the same sex doesn't mean he doesn't have an underlying heterosexual nature. The homosexual attraction.
Okay, an underlying heterosexual nature. I like what it seems like. What does that even like mean? An underlying heterosexual nature, like like what prop? What? I mean, I know he's denying that there's properties, but what is the underlying heterosexual nature? I'm assuming he's gonna say something like, oh, um, it is in people's there's a subjective fact that it is in um, a person's end that they must you know use their genitalia for proper reproductive purposes or something. But I mean, it seems to me that it's either they're saying something uninteresting, which is that the evolutionary purpose of the genitalia, the evolutionary like the way evolution um, sort of the way our penises were developed through evolution is such that they are meant to produce offspring. They're meant to um, you know for reproductive success. That's just basic natural selection, right? Because the people who the species or the sort of the species that failed with respect to reproductive success, you know, died out, and so the species that had certain attributes that contribute to reproductive success um, are the ones that survived. So yes, there's an evolutionary sort of benefit, um, and there's a biological disposition there, in the sense of yes, there's an evolutionary story that's told about why we have penises, and it has to do with our they're not designed. I don't want to say because that implies like a sort of purpose, but whatever non-purposeful language you want to use, um, in the sense that yeah, the penis's evolutionary sort of objective, you might say, or evolutionary aim, is to produce. Right? He might be saying something interesting there, in which case it just reduces to just you know um, yeah, yeah, that's just biological features developed through evolution from years of the evolutionary process, which we can tell through some evolutionary story, right? And it seems to me I can happily grant that, but um, it seems to me that he wants to say something else here. He wants to say not just that there was this evolutionary benefit to um, that the evolutionary purpose of the penis is aimed at reproduction, right? It seems to me he wants to say something more than that. It seems to me he wants to say that there's an objective end that the penis is designed to fulfill, and if you fail to meet that end, then you're failing with respect to the nature that you ought to abide by. It seems to me he's saying something normative there, but it seems to me that I can grant that there's this proper functioning of my penis is to produce offspring, and I could fail to be motivated by that sort of proper functioning, and it seems to me if he wants to say that he wants to build into the concept of proper functioning normativity, he wants to build this idea of normativity and teleology and normativity into the concept of um, proper functioning. Well, it seems to me that he just runs into the naturalistic fallacy again, because all you're saying when you say that people should um, abide by their their proper functioning is that people's proper functioning is their proper functioning, right? You're not saying anything interesting there. It falls right into the naturalistic fallacy. Perhaps he wants to say something like there's a synthetic identity there, but um, that would definitely need to be motivated because synthetic identities are things that we discover, right? We discover that the chemical constitution of H2O is something we discover. It seems that what we discover is um, facts about evolution. We don't discover that there's some objective end there. Um, I guess he might say that we discover that in the sense that we discover the existence of God in the way in His commands for us. I guess he might want to say something like that. Um, but in that case, we go back into debating the existence of God, which in my review of his previous video, I take to have shown has not yet been sufficiently motivated. Um, so there's two claims he could be making here. He could be making an uninteresting descriptive claim, in which case, I mean, we can just grant that. Seems fine. Um, seems perfectly acceptable, and it seems like even trans people will accept that. Um, or he's making a normative claim, and he's saying that there's an objective biological or an objective teleological end that the penis must serve, otherwise you're failing with respect to your nature. And I think that that's actually the claim he wants to make, but I think it doesn't work, and I think it needs to be motivated. And I don't think that there's any good motivations for it. I have actually read some of the literature in natural law theory, and I'm not convinced. And I think it falls into the naturalistic fallacy.
Action could more easily be described as an improper accident of a person, an underlying nature which is incorrectly manifested.
So yeah, see, he's using normative language here. This is exactly what I'm saying. Incorrectly manifested, right? Incorrectly is a standard which he's saying that there's a standard that you can succeed or fail to with respect to, right? He's building in normative language into the idea of this biological disposition that people have. He's building it in. He's building normativity into it, but that just falls into the naturalistic fallacy, right? If you're saying that it's the case that people's proper functioning, like that their people's evolutionary purpose or their natural purpose for their sexual organs is X, right? It doesn't follow that if people use it for some other purpose, that they're failing with respect to some standard, that they're doing something that they ought not to do. It doesn't logically follow. And if you just define proper functioning to include normativity, well, then that just falls into the naturalistic fallacy. You're just uttering a tautology, right? You're just saying that, well, your proper functioning is your proper functioning. You're just saying, I might be explaining myself badly, right? But you're not saying anything normative there if you're just defining it in that case and you're just building it into the concept, right? So if you're just building it into the concept, then it seems to me that you're just failing to say something normative or interesting. If you're not building it into the concept, then you need to explain how it logically follows that there's this evolutionary sort of disposition to reproduce. Um, that it follows um, that it's in our nature and that we must reproduce, and that there's an ought there. So seems to me that there's two different claims here. One of them hasn't been motivated and falls into the naturalistic fallacy. And I can actually, you know what? In fact, I think I'm going to link a bunch of stuff because I know I talked about Von and Wagon's paper on being essence and ontological commitment. I'll post one in the naturalistic fallacy in the description as well, and I'll post one for the study on true simultaneous hermaphrodites as well. Um, but the basic idea of the naturalistic fallacy is um, if you just define normativity with respect to some non-normative properties, then you're not saying anything normative because when you say X is good, all you're referring to is pleasure, right? All you're saying is X instantiates some non-normative property. So you're not saying anything normative there. You're not saying anything interesting there. So it's a sort of problem with analytic reductions of the good, um, and that's why I'm. It's at least it's one reason why I'm not really convinced that normativity is reducible. Of course, there's more. You get more responses from people like synthetic naturalists, um, but I haven't seen an account that convinces me in this regard. Um, and so, generally speaking, um, I would say that I'm a moral non-naturalist. Um, but in any case, um, let's continue.
What you'll notice is that these views, opposed to the traditional conservative view, are based on an underlying centralization on emotions. People will set up emotions as the underlying nature, basically. So if you feel like a homosexual,
Okay, it's not based on emotions, right? We're saying that what makes people um, have a certain gender is just their conformity with some set of social characteristics or their identity with respect to how they perform themselves, how they like engage in society and the way they perform, because gender is performative, right? It's expressive, performative. Um, Seems to me that that's all they're saying, right? And they're not saying that it's based on feelings. There's no all it is. All gender is just identifying with a set of with a set of social characteristics. We're not saying that emotion makes something true or something or whatever weird claim he seems to be making here. Um, Seems to me that if we just take gender just to be conformity with a set of social um, characteristics, then it seems to me that I mean, is there you can say that it's emotion and you can like use loaded language like this, but exactly what are they wrong about? Like it does seems to me that there's nothing that they're wrong about if they're just taking transgenderism to just mean um, identifying with a certain set of social characteristics that are not typically ascribed to the given sex that they were born as, right? Um, I mean, you can say that that's emotion, right? But that's it's not really an argument.
that's your true nature. If you feel like a male, that's your true nature. But of course, there
Well, well, I mean, first of all, he's saying male. Male has nothing to do with this, right? You're just equivocating between sex and gender at this point. Male is just the biology, right? Um, Male is just a set of biological features, right? Um, so when people say that male man like when they're a man is because they identify as a man, what they're saying is that all a man is just a certain social category, right? They're not saying that they're not saying that they're a male, right? They're not claiming to be something to have certain biological features that they don't have. Otherwise, that they'd just be like wrong, right? They're not saying anything false. They're just identifying with a certain social category. Um, and if anything, it's just you who's just failing to realize that you're equivocating here. There's two different senses here. Um, and right, so transgenders don't claim to be to have certain biological features they don't have. That's all really there is to say. I'm just repeating myself at this point. Um, and I'm probably not explaining myself the best because in terms of live streams, I come off, uh, sort of autistic. I don't really, I'm not really great at explaining myself. Um, but I hope I was able to. I hope people here are able to understand the points I'm driving at here. Um, If he's making a normative claim, it fails. If he's making a non-normative claim, it's trivial, and the transgenders can agree to it. Um, and he's sort of making a bunch of subtle equivocations between gender and sex here
There's no
that I don't even know if he's noticing.
reason to believe this is how we actually define things. And there is plenty of reasons to think that just because you feel that a certain thing is true doesn't make it true. If you feel like you're a whale, that doesn't make you a whale.
Okay. See, this is this is the classic Apache attack helicopter meme. Um, I mean this video is 10 months old, so it's 2021. I mean, it's pretty old, dude. It's a meme that's been debunked pretty thoroughly multiple times. Like even standard like fucking Twitter leftists know how to debunk this meme at this point. Like, come on, dude. Like you. So the basic idea is yes, when people who are not whales claim to be a whale, and what they mean is that they have certain like actual like physical properties, and they're like by whale by whale they mean like a certain set of physical properties that are instantiated in the whale in the world. Sorry, oh, fuck, I'm explaining myself badly. But if by whale they mean a certain set of physical properties that whales instantiate, and they say that they're a whale and they don't have those physical properties, and that's just going to be a case of a false belief, right? They're just wrong about that. They don't have those physical properties, so they're not a whale. But when a transgender person claims that they're a certain that they're a man or a woman, all they're saying is that they identify with respect to a certain set of social characteristics, or that they have a certain set of mental traits that are associated with a certain gender, and they have like desires to perform certain ways, they dress a certain way. That's all they mean. That's all they mean. They identify with the social category of man, or female, or woman. That's all they mean. They're not claiming to have a certain set of physical traits they don't have. That they're just claiming that that's their social identity. That's they identify with this social category. So, in terms of this, you're just all that's being said here is you're just making a category error, and they're not claiming to have certain physical properties they don't have. It's just you're just equivocating there.
If you feel like the earth is flat, that doesn't make the earth flat. When
Okay, yeah. These are pretty terrible analogies, dude. Like it's just, like it's a pretty dead meme, and the fact that you're saying this in 2021, I mean, bro, I mean, come on.
considering what sex a person is, we need to focus on what's more likely to be an improper accident. If a person were born with a male physiology, but he feels like a female, is it more likely that a person's feelings are distorted, or that the entire male physiology was distorted?
Oh God. Okay, this video is actually pretty bad. Um, yeah, sorry, Thomistic Disputations, but this is a pretty bad video. You're once again failing to realize the distinction between sex and gender. You're equivocating on what people mean when they say that they're a different gender than their sex. You're failing to understand that that doesn't mean that they have certain physiological characteristics that they don't have. They're not saying that, dude. They're not saying that. They're saying that they identify with a certain set of social characteristics, and they have a certain set of phenomenological experiences um, that is that identifies with the social category of man or woman. So you're just equivocating here, and you're failing to understand what the claim of the trans person even is, right? And you're just doing the meme that's been refuted over and over again. Uh, so yeah, I mean, there's not much else to say here.
It's obviously more likely that the feelings are distorted. Now, switch gears to gender. The primary problem with the left wing view of gender is that they will say things are socially constructed which are not socially constructed.
Okay, uh, let's see what examples he gives here.
The tendency for girls to play with dolls, for example, is a feature that has been recognized even in female monkeys.
Okay, so um, I think he's like misunderstanding what they mean when they say that it's a social construction, right? We can say that there's certain evolutionary reasons for it. Like we can say that The reason women tend to play with dolls or tend to desire to play with dolls. There's going to be both social causes and evolutionary causes for it. I think. Um, so like we can say that one of the evolutionary reasons is going to be some reason like it's going to be beneficial for the survival of our genes if women know how to take care of babies, right? Because you know that's what the um, female is. She gives birth to the baby, and it's going to be useful for the survival of our species if women learn from birth how to take care of a baby. And like I guess the doll could be like sort of like a practice run for that. And so that's you can tell like an evolutionary story for that. Like I'm not like I wouldn't never deny that. I don't even think that trans people would deny that. But there's also going to be like certain social reasons for it. Um, you know, like certain companies obviously tailor their dolls towards women, and that's going to cause women to desire to um, desire dolls more often. Um, and yeah, but like desiring dolls, like that seems clearly to be this. Even if there is some evolutionary story you can tell there to explain it, it seems clearly that it is a social characteristic because all we mean by social characteristic is just a behavior that um, it's a part it's a one behavior that contributes to the social category of women. So when a woman behaves in a way such a way as like to use her doll to like dolls and stuff, that's one way of her performing her womanhood, right? And even if there is an evolutionary reason for it, which I'm happy to grant in this case, I don't think that evolutionary stories are going to be the case for all um, certain for all like social characteristics. But I think here plausibly that there is an evolutionary story we can tell, um, and that's fine, right? But it's still a social characteristic, right? Because it's part of how a woman performs her identity of womanhood in society, and that's all we mean by social characteristic, and that's all we really mean by. Um, it's not the case that we like that women objectively have to um, play with dolls. I don't think. I don't even think Thomistic would say that. Um, it's just a fact about. It's just a sociological fact that that's what women tend to do. Um, and it's going to be partly explained by societal reasons and partly explained by this evolutionary story we can tell.
It's not only cross-cultural, but cross-species. So the idea that this is some social construct is ridiculous. Similar to sex.
Again, we saying that something is a social construct doesn't mean that we can't have some evolutionary story which explains it, right? Um, yeah, the two things are not inconsistent.
And sexual attraction, however, some people will point out that there are rare cases where girls do not want to play with dolls, but these likewise can be chalked up to improper accidents which are contrary to the underlying female nature.
So, um, like I don't understand why we should accept this idea of like proper accidents. It seems to me that like when women don't like want to play with dolls, that's just a case um where they're not performing what we would take to be a social attribute of their womanhood. That's just a case where they fail to exemplify a certain social characteristic, right? I don't I don't know why we should accept that there's this underlying nature that's part of what it is to be a woman that they play with dolls. Like that seems to be like a weird sort of metaphysical assumption that um, at, at at this point, 9 minutes into the video, 9 minutes and 30 seconds into the video, he still, I take it, hasn't justified. Um, but we can. I mean, there's 3 minutes left, so we can wait.
Whenever we're trying to discover what nature is, it's more reasonable to assume the majority case is the underlying female nature properly.
So like, why think the majority case is indicative of some underlying nature? Like, doesn't seem like I don't see the inference there. Like, it could be that the majority of people, um, maybe like this isn't true, but like maybe it could turn out that the majority of people um, bite their nails, right? And um, I mean, is it part of? the nature to be a person to bite your nails? I mean, seems like a sort of odd claim. Um, and I don't even understand why we even have to infuse this idea of teleology into this conceptual scheme here. Um, Seems like we can convey all the same understanding, um, all our understanding without it. So it just seems like an unjustified metaphysical assumption.
Expressed, then that the few rare cases is the underlying female nature. Now, what about things that are actually socially constructed?
Well, I mean, who says that there even has to be an underlying female nature? Like, you're the one who's using that language, and it doesn't seem like that has to be a language that the transgender person has to be committed to.
Even those, I think we cannot make a strict division between nature and social constructs. Take clothing, for example. Obviously, clothing varies across culture. However, that doesn't mean that clothing cannot either be consistent with nature or inconsistent. One of the purposes can
So
involve
again, he's using, I guess, consistent or inconsistent. Uh, it has a normative import. I'm not sure if it's inherently normative. I guess you can like reasonably deny that it's normative, but I take normative to just be some like standard that one can succeed or fail. Like at least part of what it is to be normative is that there's a standard that one succeeds or fails to exemplify or fails with respect to. Um, Sorry, that was my phone. Um, um, I better end this quickly because that was my phone that went off. So yeah, I have the BoJack Horseman theme song for my phone. Um, God, I kind of lost my point here, but um, yeah, I take normative to be failing or succeeding with respect to some standard, and um, and it seems to me he hasn't justified the normativity of just these bare biological dispositions.
making a person look attractive.
All right, I'm gonna speed it up.
So, take the corset, for example.
He's using
Obviously,
symbols.
the fact that women wear corsets is a cultural construct. It isn't even as much a part of our culture today as it used to be. However, it has been shown cross culturally that one of the major indicators of fertility
So all he's doing there is just saying that there's Uh, yeah, so that there's a reason for it, that there's some explanation in terms of like men tend to find women who have a lesser waist to hip ratio more attractive, and that's probably going to be explained by evolutionary reasons, like women, like women being more attractive, like men are going to be more likely to reproduce with them, and reproduction good for the survival of the species, natural selection. Well accepted among the sciences. I don't even think Thomistic is going to deny that evolution by natural selection is a thing. Um, yeah. Uh, no one's going to deny that there's going to be some ultimate evolutionary story here. What's controversial here is you like infusing this entire idea with just this idea of teleology and building it into the concept. And I don't see why we should accept that.
and likewise attractiveness is a low waist to hip ratio. What does a corset do? It lowers a woman's waist to hip ratio, thus making a woman look more attractive.
Right. Right. This is what I'm saying. Yeah.
So, although it is a cultural construct, it isn't an arbitrary social construct. It's a social construct.
Well, I don't think anyone needs to be committed to it being arbitrary. No, like I don't think anyone. I don't even think like even the most radical transgender ideologues would say that fucking it's arbitrary. Like what if it's arbitrary? Then like what even is the entire point of sociology? Like we want to come up with reasons why humans tend to have some sort of like societal we tend to develop some certain societal like behaviors. um, yeah, like obviously there's a reason. I don't think it like otherwise the entire project of sociology would just be bankrupt, right? Or the entire project of of evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology, even. Um, it would just be entirely bankrupt, and I don't think anyone's saying that.
That is consistent with a woman's nature and which helps her to achieve her ends of attracting a mate. If men wore corsets, they would look silly. not merely because our culture says men don't wear corsets, but because attractiveness and fertility in males are not tied to the same waist to hip ratio that we see in women. So even
And again, I can grant that, but at this point, I'm just repeating myself, so this is getting a little bit boring. So we'll just finish
the
this off.
social constructs of gender are not arbitrary, they are grounded in the differences between what males and females are. But still, this doesn't explain
Um, no one says they're arbitrary. That they're people are willing to grant that there's going to be sociological explanations or evolutionary stories that explain certain behaviors exhibited differently between males and females. No one's going to disagree with that. Um, what's at stake here is this idea that gender performance is going to be like established is going to be essential, and it's going to like flow essentially from a person's biology. um, that's something you haven't established, and you also haven't established some of your bigger like metaphysical baggage you seem to be assuming in the background, which is objective teleology. With like I think you're making some normative claims here. Maybe you don't understand that you're making normative claims here, but I take it that um, you're building normativity into this idea, which ends up committing the naturalistic fallacy. Um, there's a bunch of problems here,
why we ought to make our gender
and the problem isn't what you're suggesting. The problem isn't that people don't understand that like there's evolutionary reasons for women wearing fucking corsets. Like no one denies that. No, like evolutionary reasons, sociological reasons. No one denies that. No one.
sex, or sexuality consistent with our underlying nature. This requires an exposition of the natural law theory of morality that I'm not going to get into here, but basically, as St. Thomas
Yeah, see, so yeah, he's assuming natural law theory here. I don't buy into natural law theory personally, um, and one of the main reasons is well, the naturalistic fallacy. The main reason I've been discussing here. I don't think that there's a convincing way um, for natural law theorists to escape the Morean objection, um, and then to motivate their view um, that um, proper functioning ought to be how we understand like moral obligations, right? I've never seen any such convincing motivation for that. So it's possible. I definitely agree that it's possible that that the natural law theorists can avoid the naturalistic fallacy, um, but then it just seems to me that um, they have to they have to do a lot of work to motivate their view, and I haven't seen any good motivations for it. But that's of course a topic for that can be discussed another day.
Aquinas said, "A natural desire is nothing else but an inclination belonging to things by disposition of the first mover." So the underlying nature is due to God's will, and so going against our underlying nature is going against God's will.
And so he's like ultimately what he's assuming here is obviously theism and a very strong sort of teleological ethic, um, which I accept neither. So ultimately, I'm not convinced, and ultimately, yeah, I'm just not convinced. And ultimately, it just seems to me that um, that no trans person should be convinced by this, unless he does more to rationally motivate his view.
So assuming we ought to follow God's will, which is a conclusion that we will come to through the Proving Christianity series I'm working on, assuming that it will follow that we ought to follow our natures, which were implanted by God. But this
Well, I mean, there we go. I mean, there you go. Like that's pretty much what I've been saying this whole time that we all. Um, and I actually did talk to Thomistic about this idea of natural law theory, and he basically ended up just saying that all it is really a hypothetical norm. We ought to follow our natures given that we have a desire to, and it's just going to be the case that all men have the desire to follow their natures. Um, and we have discussed this, but it seems to me that when you're denying categorical normativity, that it seems to me that that just you're just not talking about morality at that point, because I think morality concerns those norms which are categorical, right? Those norms which you have a reason to obey, even if you desire not to obey them, right? That's what it seems to me that morality is about. Um, and it seems to me that he says his position is in a way categorical because he says that all men have this desire, but it seems to me that it's just false, right? Like I mean. unless you have an independent reason to think that trans people are mistaken about what their own desires are, um, then it seems to me that a bunch of trans people desire to identify with a certain um, gender that's distinct from their sex. And unless you have a good independent reasons to think that's false, then I mean, why should I believe that? Anyways, um, this pretty much concludes this video. This went on for a lot longer than I expected it to. This live stream is just 2 hours long, almost 2 hours, and all I did was respond to like two, like one video was less than 10 minutes, I think, and this video was just 12 minutes. And it took me like 2 hours to respond to it. So wow, um, wow. Uh, it just goes to show how much I've been like rambling. Like I'm pretty bad at this actually. Like I I constantly go yawn, nah, 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 ramble, ramble, ramble. Barely even get to the fucking point. Um, and stumble over my words often. I hope at least that this was at least somewhat educational and that people are able to track um, like the kind of points I'm making here. In any case, I thought this was kind of an interesting response video. Um, I might do more of these just out of boredom. Um, any case, I think I'm just gonna like I've been talking long enough. Like, look at me right now. I'm fucking still rambling. So I better fucking stop myself right here. Um, I don't really know how to end videos though. Like, what should I say? Should I say peace? Should I say shout? You know what? I'm actually rambling again, and this is getting quite embarrassing actually.